The question that we're going to try to, or one of the questions that we're going to try to confront in this last lecture, is the question of how the teachings of Jesus can be made operational on a social level. It seems to me that from family, through schools, through government, through business, all our institutions are close to being ultimately grounded in violence, in the use of dominative power, in the use of fear. That parents, that so-called bosses, military leaders, politicians are all overwhelmed, if you will, with the fact that they have their little domain or jurisdiction in which they can exercise coercive power on others. If what we are talking about is true, then it is a fact that man is gregarious. People are independent, but they are also interdependent. They act as social units, and if what we are saying is true, it must be able to be lived in some form of human association. Is there any possibility of forming human community free of violence, free of coercion, human community that has as its basic dynamic, its ground zero, agape? Historically speaking, of course, there are precedents for this. But what I'd like to do, rather than to talk about the fact that Christian communities and other religious communities have existed in a pacific lifestyle as social units for hundreds of years at a time, is I would like to suggest what are the bases, or what is the basis for thinking through some understanding of what the ingredients are of such a community. It seems to me that there is an intimate relationship, a possible intimate relationship, between the idea of democracy and Christianity and the teachings of Jesus. Now, clearly, what I'm not talking about is the kind of pseudo-democracy that functions, say, in the United States or Western Europe or Japan today. What I'm talking about is the real thing. If I were asked what the definition of church is, what the definition of Christian community is, my answer would be the Christian community, or church, is a Christ-centered, non-dominative community of service to suffering humanity. Christian community, or church, is a Christ-centered, non-dominative community of service to suffering humanity. The question then becomes, how does one establish what are the principles of organization? What are the principal dynamics on which this kind of community is built? Is it possible to have a non-dominative community of service to suffering humanity? All right. It seems to me the answer is yes, and it seems to me that it revolves around an understanding not only of agape, but of democracy. Democracy as we know, was originated, as we know it, in Greece. The original form of democracy was something called direct democracy. Direct democracy was a situation where all those people who were considered human beings and citizens in Greece came to the forum and voted directly on the rules that were going to govern their society. Admittedly, all kinds of people were not considered human beings, slaves, women, and so forth. But to be human was to be self-governing, was not to have people imposing upon you. All very well and good. Direct democracy was the original form of democracy in Greece and Iceland, and even in the Americas. The Mayflower Compact was a direct democratic system. Also, in the New England town meetings, direct democracy was a way of people coming together to decide the rules that they were going to live under. All very well and good. The point is, in 1787, when the federal government was established, it became impossible for reasons of time and space and communication to continue a direct democratic system. So what was done was that we moved into a representative system. That is, supposedly the idea was that people would be elected to represent what the majority's view was to the parliamentary body. Now, Gandhi makes the point that all law is not violent. Laws which people impose upon themselves are nonviolent. I'll get that. All law is not violent. Laws that people impose upon themselves is nonviolent. The idea that law that's imposed upon oneself is nonviolent comes out of the understanding that if I agree to go along with the majority rule, or if I agree to go along with a particular rule, then no one has to impose it on me. I am going with it. It's my voluntary decision. The problem is, of course, that Gandhi is not talking about the kind of thing that we have in the United States or in Western Europe or Japan, as I said. In fact, he refers to Western democracy as nothing other than a donkey for fascism. In fact, he prophesies that Western democracy will either have to become democratic or become clearly fascist. What he is talking about is the legitimate situation, a legitimate democratic situation where people actually decide the rules that they're going to live under and the rules that they're going to pay for. What are we talking about? We're talking about the kind of situation where people return to are engaged in some sort of direct democratic process, concretely deciding either by unanimity, which means a 100% vote, or by somewheres from 50%, 51% on through, that they are going to live under certain rules and regulations. Why is this important? Well, it's important because it is a process that eliminates coercion from the organizational principles of a community. However, democracy can be, as I hinted before, can be a process of unanimity, or it can be a process of something in the vicinity of 51%. Whatever the rule is that is decided upon for making a rule, that rule has to be unanimous. In other words, what I'm saying is that 100%, in order to have a genuine democracy, 100% of the people under that democracy have to agree to abide by rules that are determined by 51%, or they can decide 66% or 75%, or perhaps a unanimous decision that only those rules will govern the society where 100% of the people agree to them. Now, mind you, the idea is that the rule determining which percentage is going to govern society has to be agreed to by 100% of the people. Otherwise, coercion is involved. Now, direct democracy is a way of governing a Christian community. It's a way of governing a Christian community that Christians have employed. For example, I can remember going to a Quaker meeting. Quakers function on a principle of direct democracy. All those who are affected by the decision have a say in the decision and an equal say. No decision is made unless it is unanimous, unless all agree to it. This is longer in its initial approach. In other words, in a hierarchical authority, decisions can be made rather quickly. That when you have a democratic system, you lose the initial efficiency because all kinds of people have an input. But for those who would say that democratic decision-making is less efficient, I would at least make this suggestion: that it is hierarchical decision-making that is most inefficient, because hierarchical decisions are conceived in the minds of one or a few and carried out in the hearts of no one. Or if they are carried out in the hearts of people, they're carried out because of coercion and fear and domination. Whereas genuinely unanimous democratic decisions are made in the minds and the hearts of everyone, and the commitment is there for everyone to carry it out. This is why democracy has some genuine potential for being aligned with Christian community, with church. However, democracy is only a method of decision-making. Only a method of decision-making. It can make good or bad decisions. The method can be employed either erotically or it can be employed agapeistically. For decisions, democratic, even though they may be, for decisions to be Christian, they must employ the spirit of agape. Without the spirit of agape, the decision is not Christian. How is this accomplished? Well, for example, in those Christian communities, not just Quaker communities, but Catholic communities of religious orders and so forth, even some parishes, in those places where Christian communities function in a democratic, agapeic spirit, the way it is accomplished is that all decisions that are made in a liturgical context by all people who want to make them and who are going to be affected by them. The liturgical context is important. Why? Because whether regardless of what kind of Christian community you're dealing with, if you're making a decision, the tendency is to look at how the decision can best be made in my self-interest. Whereas, if we are functioning agapeistically, we are not self-centered, we are other-centered. In order to continually do this, there has to be an interspersing of rational ideas plus reflection plus prayer. Rational ideas presented in monologue or dialogue, plus time interspersed for recollection, for bringing people back to the fact that they are supposed to be Christians, functioning as Christians, thinking, speaking, deciding democratically in an agapeistic spirit. If the church is to be a Christ-centered, non-dominative community of service to suffering humanity, it can only do this, in my opinion, if it moves towards a model that is basically directly democratic and agapeistic. With that kind of discussion of how what we have been talking about, that is, a Pacific Christian ethic, could possibly be instituted socially in the Christian community, and it can be, and it has been, we might note that there are just a few thoughts that are not quite ancillary, but not quite on the subject that we have just finished speaking, on which we have just finished speaking, that we probably want to cover before we finish. The first one is this, and I suggest it to you more or less in terms of a model to use for your own reflection on the subject of violence, personal violence as well as social violence. The most commonly accepted psychological formula for violence is what's called the frustration aggression. Frustration aggression theory. Basically what this says is, here's the individual human being. He wants to reach a goal over here. Here's his goal. He feels that the means he must choose to reach the goal are these that will carry him from here to here. All very well and good. Something interferes. Something frustrates his getting there. Now, when something frustrates a person's effort to attain a goal, there are all kinds of things he can do. He can give up on the goal. He can bypass the goal, try other means. There are all kinds of things he can do. One of the things he can do is he can try to eliminate the object of his frustration. He can attack it. He can become aggressive towards it and try to move it forcefully. When, for example, the goal is something to the effect of, I want to get downtown, and something, or let's say I want to go and give a speech on agape, and children are standing in the way of the door and they won't get out of the way, and I can, just move them right out of the way, kick them right out of the way, and get down and give my talk on Christian love. That's clear. There's a goal. The children are frustrating my reaching it, so I simply remove them by coercion, by dominative power, by aggression, by violence. All right. That's clear enough. But what happens when the goal is not, or let's put it that way, let's put it this way first. What happens when what is causing the frustration is not as clear? That is, where we are not reaching a goal and we can't quite figure out what it is that's causing the problem. For example, we're poor and we want to be rich, and we don't know what's causing the problem. The danger is that what we will do is we will set up a symbolic cause of the frustration, which is known as a scapegoat, and we will attack the scapegoat as if it really were what was causing us not to reach our goal. How many parents attack children because of things that go on in the office? How many of us attack other people because of goals that we can't reach, and we think they are the ones who are keeping us from reaching them? Finally, what happens when our goal now, not what's frustrating it, but our goal is something that's impossible to reach? Suppose our goal is survival. Suppose the thing that we want to do is survive. We don't want to be annihilated. We don't want to die. We don't want to go into oblivion forever. Suppose that's the goal. It's that inferral. It's that vague, but it's real. Suppose that's the goal, and day in and day out, all around us, we get hints from people who are dying, from our hair turning gray, to our aches and pains, that we can't achieve it, that we're not achieving it. Then what happens? Suppose we have an unattainable goal. Once again, there is also the danger of the scapegoat. That we begin to pick on individuals or groups that are keeping us from attaining what we're not attaining, but who really aren't. Christianity, on the other hand, it seems to me, has a practical solution to this problem. You know, forgiveness is a practical road to peace. Forgiveness simply means that one of the contending parties stop contending and start doing good to the other party. There's nothing more practical than that. The same thing here. Here's the Christian. What is the one important single goal in the Christian's life? The goal is agape. To live, to incarnate agape. Love. Christian love. To live agapeistically is what the goal of the Christian life is. Not to have money, not to have few or many children, not to win political causes, to live agapeistically. That is the goal, day in and day out. That's what we're about as Christians. Now note, what are the means to that goal? The means to that goal, agape. Agape is the means, agape is the end. There is no one outside you, absolutely no one, that can frustrate agape. There is no outside possibility, no external possibility of frustrating a Christian from reaching his goal. Only the Christian can do that. Money can be taken away, suffering can be inflicted, natural disasters can come, political upheaval can come. But if agape is the end, agape is the means, and it's within the control of the Christian to live that way. If there is frustration in the Christian living the Christian's life, the frustration is totally internal. There is no one to blame but the Christian himself. There is a consistency, in other words, between means and end, a total consistency. Okay. One, if you will, one final thought on a separate subject that we might want to consider is this. When we talked about truth a while back, we said that Gandhi, Newman, Buber, Jesus put enormous emphasis on truth, on not lying. Consider for a minute truth from this perspective here. Here's one person and here's the other person. Now these individuals are unique. Each of them, let's say, has his own sense of truth. Each of them has his own sense of truth. Now look at the problem. Truth is intimately, an individual's truth is intimately connected, irrevocably connected with the individual's meaning in his life. What is true to him is what is reality, is what is meaningful to him. I'm just suggesting that once we get into the business of coercion, of coercing truth, of using dominative power to coerce people into following our truth, it's not just that we're using fear, that we're using threat of suffering or the actual suffering itself to get people to do our wills. What is worse is that we're making people live a meaningless life. To make people live a truth that is not their truth is to make them live in meaninglessness. Life is meaningful if we're living what we see as meaningful, if we're living our truth. If we are being forced to live someone else's truth, under the threat of suffering, violence, or what have you, coercion, life degenerates into meaninglessness. The question that I have is this, and I'll just leave it with you. How important is the spirit of agape? How important is the spirit of agape for the pursuit of truth and meaning? How important is it for the genuine pursuit of truth and meaning? It seems to me that there is a great deal to be said. That if what I'm looking for is, I am looking for that dimension of reality, that understanding of reality that will satisfy my self-interest in one form or another, that will protect and save and help my self-interest in one form or another survive, if that's the approach I'm taking to truth, the truth that I'm going to receive is going to be and perceive is the truth that I want to receive, is the truth that I want to perceive in order to maintain, justify, rationalize the self-interest that I want to keep. It seems to me that there is an absolute ingredient here that is absolutely required. If truth is to be pursued, it has to be pursued in an atmosphere that is free of fear, in an atmosphere of freedom. And secondly, it has to be pursued in a disinterested, dispassionate, if you will, agapeistic spirit. That is, it has to be pursued not for the purpose of simply finding what is in my own interest. In any event, it seems to me only human to let other people live their meaning, their lives, to let other people live their truths. And it seems diabolically inhuman to force human beings to live your meaning, your sense of truth. In other words, when someone imposes his meaning on someone else, there is no meaning for that someone else. That someone else is being forced to live a meaningless life. And that's awfully serious. Finally, let me conclude by pointing out that everything that we've been talking about in Christianity has to be taken as a process and not as a product. This is a way of becoming. Remember the Didache, the oldest piece of literature that we have in Christianity. It talks about there are two ways. There's the way of light and the way of dark. It talks about Christianity as a process. Let me point out, using the Didache format, what we've been talking about. There's a way of light, there's a way of dark. There's a way of eternal life, there's a way of eternal death. There's a way of eternal being, a way to eternal nothingness. There's the way of reconciliation and the way of victory. The way of forgiveness, the way of retaliation. The way of unconditional care, the way of reciprocation. The way of diaconia, the way of dominative power. The way of freedom, the way of fear. The way of agape, the way of eros. The way of nonviolence, the way of violence. The way of the suffering servant, the way of hardness of heart. The way of love, the way of law. The way of service, the way of survival. The way of consensus, the way of coercion. The way of good for evil, the way of evil for evil. There's the way of peace, the way of war. The way of treating persons as persons, the way of treating persons as things. The way of yielding, the way of conquering. The way of suffering for truth, the way of imposing truth. The way of loving an enemy, the way of keeping your powder dry. There's the way of the cross and the way of the sword. The way of the new man, the way of the old man. The way of Buddha, the way of Alexander the Great. The way of Gandhi, the way of Mao, the way of Christ, the way of Caesar. We know to go in one direction for 5 years, or go in the other direction for 5 years, will mean at the end of that period, an entirely different person will exist. The two ways are incompatible. We must choose.